Greetings and welcome to another episode of You Talk. After some lengthy technical difficulties, we are back on the air, so to speak. And today we are going to answer the question as part of our, is it a four-parter now?
It is a four-parter now. We've
Yeah,
consolidated a little.
Yes, a four-parter on war, peace, and security. And our question is, where is the modern war actually fought, and are the nukes actually going to fly? So,
Excellent.
uh, so this I suspect two answers to this question. The first being, if there was a war, assuming assuming it would be between the expected players, where would that war be fought? But I suspect that your answer is actually very different to that, as it would be it would be in part, how is modern warfare fought?
Where
In
and how,
so
yes.
yes. So why don't you get into that, and at some point maybe we'll come back around to if there was a conventional war, where the theater would be.
Okay, so I'm gonna give you the real brief summary right now. You can
Mhm.
stop after this if you absolutely want to, but everywhere you wouldn't think regarding where is a war actually fought in the modern day, and probably not with regards to nukes flying. And we've been over this in the previous sections of this little précis. Nobody wants a war. Nobody actually wants a war. Nobody in their right mind wants a war. And even if a war is fought, there is a lot to go through before we start threatening the use of nuclear weaponry.
And even the threat of them doesn't mean that it's going to happen. I mean, look at Ukraine. Putin's been threatening for what, more than 6 months now, that nuclear weapons are on the table. Not one has fought. It's
They're
not. It's
still on the
probably not.
table. That's the
Well,
problem.
they're on the table.
But
Yes.
I'll also point out that Russia has recently removed itself from the START 2 SALT Treaty. Those are the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty and the Strategic Arms Restrictions Treaty, both of which were commitments on the part of both Russia and the US to reduce their stockpiles of long-range nuclear weaponry, because fewer nuclear bombs means less risk of nuclear apocalypse, right? Simple.
Hmm.
But as to how a modern war is fought, this comes back to what I said about provocations. You see, war is so much more than sending people to fight and die over a tiny little piece of land. We probably first saw this in the would have been the Second Gulf War. The proxy war that was the first Gulf War had basically two sides: the US and what was left of the Soviet Union. The US trained and equipped the locals, and the Soviets trained and equipped the locals. Perfect way to conduct a war. Nobody you actually care about gets hurt, and this tiny little part of the world that I'm sure will not come back to bite anyone in the ass later gets massively wrecked by a power game. I'm sure nothing could possibly go wrong. Now, tell me, Kyle, what was that wonderful construction in New York? The World Trade Center, right?
Yeah. It's two big buildings actually. About the same height. Used in a couple of movies, such as
Mm-hmm.
once it was used in a version of King Kong. I would call them beautiful buildings, but they were very much just like every other building, was just taller than most.
But
Oh,
also,
and
we're
they
talking
no
in the
longer
past
exist.
tense, because
Yes.
as it turns out, if you screw with the internal politics of a country where you don't understand the culture and you don't give a rat's about the locals, some folks might come to resent that. But the reason I bring up the First Gulf War is that we saw here the idea of asymmetrical warfare. Instead of sending in a massive conventional force, using smaller cells of soldiers who are nimble, who move in a way that is supported by the terrain to their advantage, and who do not necessarily strike in a way that is conventionally expected. When it's done to us, we call it terrorism. When we do it to other people, we call it asymmetrical warfare. That was the first change in war. The second change was that everyone started getting smart about it. You'll have heard of the idea of like cyber warfare operations. Some of that is traditional signals intelligence. We spy on people, we try and learn their secrets. Some of that is doing things like disrupting their markets. If you have a bunch of people in your country who have a lot of investments in a hostile country, and you get all of them to sell everything they have, that will depress the value of the holding in the hostile country. It's just like shorting a stock. In fact, it's exactly like that. Realistically, the problem is that warfare isn't as cut and dried as it used to be. What's happening in Ukraine right now might be one of the last conventional wars we will see. And they really are struggling over there. Warfare these days isn't about killing people. It's about enforcing a very firm power dynamic, about subjugating an enemy government, which is where this comes back to provocation. The reality is that by some interpretations, a lot of people have been at war for quite a while, and we're just not talking about it because all of these acts are taking place behind the scenes. They're little attempts between governments to get an edge up on one another, to have the stronger hand at negotiations. And in terms of conventional theaters of war, Kyle has that pretty well covered. The long and short of it is that there's only a few places that it's sensible to wage war against Australia.
Yes.
Like,
well,
5 of them tops.
Yeah. So look, let's just say that, in some horrible series of events, we end up with a war between the US and China, and we are dragged into it under our treaty obligations, that is the ANZUS Treaty.
Wouldn't you imagine a war between Great Britain and Australia?
I mean, look, that'd be a fun war, but no, that's probably never going to happen.
We hope.
Then again,
God save the king.
Okay, let's not have me figure out how to make that happen. I already have enough. I've already thought of enough horrifying things for one lifetime. Let's not add more. So let's say US versus China, we're potentially dragged into it. The key theater of war is not so much the Pacific Ocean. It's actually the Australasian archipelago. Now, the reason for this is because if you think about the strategic weaknesses of each side, well, the US doesn't have many, but China does have 2. First, it doesn't have the naval superiority to push past what's called the first island chain, which is essentially, around like Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, and sort of, all the nations around what they call the South China Seas. They can't project power beyond there. And so that's the first strategic weakness, is they're just not powerful enough to push out further than that. The second is that their nation would starve within 60 days of trade through the Strait of Malacca being cut off. Now, the Strait of Malacca, for those of you who don't know, is that small bit of water between the Malay Peninsula, that's like the western portion of Malaysia, that's not on the island of Borneo, and Sumatra, which is part of Indonesia, although, some rebels are figuring out whether or not that's going to stay that way. But either way, that narrow stretch of water, it's very narrow, but a lot of shipping goes through there, and particularly a lot of shipping for Chinese goods. So China does a lot of trade through there. Now, if India decided, it could very much close off the Strait of Malacca, and India is more and more becoming a U.S. ally by the day almost. They've reduced relations with Russia. Them and China are kind of at each other's throats due to water resource management. And
Yep.
they've been at each other's throats over various territories for a while. But water resource management is perhaps one of the latest and greatest, what's the word, opposing interests that they both have. And so that leaves the Chinese with essentially one other option, or two options. They can try and fight their way through the Strait of Malacca, which is possible, but going to be very costly. Or through the Australasian archipelago, they can circumvent the Strait of Malacca, establishing other seaborne trade routes. Now, if Australia is on the side of the US, that brings them dangerously close to Australia, exposing their shipping to our potential attacks and also our coast to their potential attacks. Now,
But
would not be able.
our treaties don't necessarily mean that we would be required to fire upon any ship trying to transit our coast. I just want to clarify that right here. Our treaties do not necessarily require that we fire on any ship, because obviously there is a certain principle of freedom of navigation that is upheld rather by various other international treaties.
Sure.
But it does
However,
mean the situation could get awkward real fast.
Yes. So there's like at that point it begins to branch into a few different scenarios. One where one side fires a shot, another where another side fires a shot, and it really depends on what the Americans expect us to do. If the US of A expects us to fire on ships and we follow that, then effectively we're at war with China on our northwest or just off our northwest coast. But that being said, it's still very much, what's the word? It's still very much a case of, that's the conventional war. Now, that's how we could get involved, but more so than that, it'll still very much be the US fighting China across the Australasian archipelago, with China trying to ensure that its trade can get through and the US trying to blockade them in. And that will be the war. And if the US succeeds, then China will begin to starve within 60 days, causing a massive humanitarian crisis. And if China wins, well, I haven't considered that scenario, but it means that the US is no longer the absolute hegemon in the world, and everyone's underestimating
China instead becomes a hegemon in the world, and that because they already have a vast production capability, in large part due to a bunch of people in the US praising the almighty dollar and deciding to send their manufacturing overseas, China holds all the cards. And we can only hope that they would be as fair and just and magnanimous as the US wouldn't be.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say they hold all the cards, but
enough of the cards to not really need to be challenged.
Well, there's a lot of scenarios that could eventuate there. I wouldn't say enough to not be challenged, because the US might want to challenge them again. Essentially, you'd see two powers who then view each other as equals, not wanting to tolerate each other if China were to win. But that being said, all of this is fortunately a very
hypothetical situation at best.
Yes.
So should we switch to the other hypothetical now about
Well,
how far a conventional war escalates quickly.
well, I mean, we kind of already said that the nukes probably aren't going to fly, and we've sort of established why that is, and we've also run out of time.
Well, then
So,
it sounds like consolidating those things was a good call. So, in conclusion, those fallout shelters are probably still going to contain god awful survival rations that are too salty, not sweet enough, and don't contain enough powdered Prozac to keep you going. The water, still in cans or in sealed pouches, will continue being water. And let me tell you, after a while in those sealed pouches, water tastes. And
and
if we can
fortunately,
keep ourselves in order, we probably need not fear dying in nuclear fire, despite the fact that many people would find it immensely profitable to push us to that point.
yes. All right, with that being said, catch you later. Have a good one.